This is my list of 27 destructive interactions. I have done this in 3 parts. Part 1, I'm really just going to explain what they are and what destructive interactions do in a specific conversation, as well as in a relationship, as well as briefly looking at where do they come from, what are they, how do they emerge in a relationship, and what lies behind them. That's part 1. In part 2 and part 3, I'll basically go through the list of 27 destructive interactions or behaviors. So very useful if you after watching this first sort of explanation, to dive into part 2 and 3 to actually go through the list. I'm not really going to reference them. So what are destructive interactions? They are things that people say to each other. That's most of them. Things they do. That's the second part. And it's usually some variation of that within a conversation. So most of these, when you're sitting with a couple, or if we're looking at a couple, maybe not in a social space, but in their home space, definitely in therapy, you will hear this. There are things that will be said and behaviors within the actual conversation. So these aren't generalized descriptions of a person, of a pattern. They are a pattern to the destructive interactions, but you will be able to observe them. Destructive interactions are problematic, and for me, as a couple therapist, it's the first thing I look at. Right from the start, in the first few sessions, I am looking out for any destructive interactions within the conversation that emerge. What did I do? Destructive interactions derail the conversation. For example, me and my wife are talking about a specific topic. If either of us use a destructive interaction or destructive behavior in that conversation, the original point or destination, or what we were moving towards, maybe it was an agreement of where we're going to go for the summer, gets derailed. We're no longer going to get there because there are all of a sudden a lot of stuff busy happening internally and between us. So the first thing is it derails the conversation. The second thing that it does is we end up having 2 different conversations. I often say to couples, you are not having the same conversation. What that means is the moment destructive interactions enter as an irritant within the conversation, and that's what it does. It's like an irritant that what subsequent interactions are no longer about the same topic. If I use a destructive interaction, my partner will internally and potentially in the relationship start responding to that, where I may still be thinking I'm going in a certain direction. This is very common with couples. They'll have long conversations, but it's actually not the same conversation, and it's not about the same topic. Every subsequent sort of exchange is me trying to respond perhaps to something you said or did, and you trying to get back to your message, because you're picking up that I'm not getting your message and I'm still affected by the destructive interaction that just took place within the behavior, within the conversation. This is very important. It derails the conversation. It always derails the conversation. It always leads to sort of these type of split conversations. And it's because of what it does. Destructive interactions trigger survival responses. We go to a place where we have to become defensive, and we now have to focus on responding to the emotional content that has been activated or triggered within us. There's only one appropriate response to destructive interactions, and that's defensiveness. Now, very often in relationship, people say, oh, he's defensive or she's defensive, and that doesn't mean that that's not true. But a lot of what destructive behaviors does is it pushes the other person to a place of defensiveness. There's only one response, and that is, I now have to go and protect myself. I have to try and protect my sense of integrity, my sense of individuality, all of that. And so whatever the person was trying to get across, the moment the destructive interaction lands within the conversation, I'm busy doing something else. So what this means is that not only are we not having the same conversation, you can see how the core message, so if I was trying to communicate something, that gets lost. So the focus shifts for the person on the receiving end towards how it is said and what is said, and what I'm actually trying to say typically gets lost. So this is just what destructive interactions do within a conversation. What do they do in relationships? So across time, the pattern of interaction between a couple across time. So number one is they create a legacy of injury. This is the slow, progressive accumulation of hurt, of things that have stung us in the relationship, things that have damaged how we see ourselves, how we see the other person, how we feel in the relationship. This is the legacy of injury. And the more the legacy of injury accumulates, the more it also affects all subsequent interactions and conversation. Within relationships, it leads to a pattern of disconnection. We never seem to be aligned. You can see if this is what happens in a single conversation, if this repeats across time, it leads to this accumulation of disconnection, this experience of not able to talk about things. And with that is also the experience of failure. For whatever reason, even though we may have very different ways of actually understanding what's happening in the relationship, our conversations tend to lead to failure because they break down, because they escalate, because we both walk out, whatever the specific pattern is. Of course, they escalate over time. They always escalate over time, usually in terms of intensity, in terms of frequency, and in terms of the actual impact, because every subsequent destructive interaction across time lands on top of the legacy of injuries, and it aggravates and irritates that, and it really makes it alive again. So if you really want to unpack destructive interactions, you will see that the more destructive interactions there are in a relationship, the more it often triggers a response, which is a defensive response, which is a survival response in the form of destructive interactions. And this is what causes this vicious cycle, where the more we are trying to respond to and cope and survive and correct, the more we do the same. So across time, what this means is there's what I call the emergence of the caricature. When I work with couples, I often talk about the caricature. So this means how across time, how I see my partner is no longer my partner. It's a caricature. It's a distorted amplification of certain qualities and the loss of certain qualities. That's usually, and it's usually negative. I become so focused on the specific way in which my partner may say and do things, and I lose track of the things that are actually positive and nurturing and affirming. And this caricature, this internalized view of the other person is very often what I see couples actually are interacting with. So what that means is, I've said earlier, I'll tell couples that you are not having the same conversation. What this manifests as, the caricature, is you will notice that they aren't actually talking to the other person. They're talking to an internalized version of the other person that's usually quite negative. And that's usually based on, in part, destructive interactions and the legacy of injury from the past. Across time, this means there's just an ongoing inability of the couple to have constructive conversations. We never have success in having conversations. We never get to the place where we leave a conversation and feel, this went well. I feel heard, I feel listened to, and the other person feels the same. It means an inability over time to resolve issues. So conversation is the most important aspect of relationship, and destructive interactions are directly impacting on our ability to have conversations. When we approach each other, there's a hypervigilance to threat. I always think of a boxing ring. The two people entering the boxing ring, and they are sort of on opposite corners. They get into this space, and even before this space, they are anticipating what's going to happen. They are anticipating and hypervigilant for certain types of behaviors, meanings, interactions. And this is where a couple gets completely paralyzed, actually, because every attempt to have a conversation is led by this preparation and anticipation for what's going to happen because of how many times it's happened. And to break that whole cycle, to interrupt that cycle, is incredibly difficult. But the core part of that process is to stop the presence of destructive interactions. And this is why, for me, this list of 27 is probably the most important part of couple therapy, because if these things are there, couple therapy will not work. Over time, within a relationship, there's a loss of safety. There's a loss of feeling, I can be in this space, it's okay for me in this space. And there's also the legacy of not feeling heard and not having my emotional needs met. And this goes for both people over time. So how do we understand this? How do we understand what are destructive behaviors? Now, we can see how a lot of destructive behaviors emerge over time in a relationship as desperations, as desperate attempts to try and change the relationship, to try and control, to try and minimize emotional intensity. Those three things are really important. Most couples across the duration of the relationship have made bids or attempts to get the other person to act differently and to try and change what happens. These are quite benign. How it's done may be problematic, but the essence of it, the intention of it, is usually quite pure and benign. Very often people try to control what happens, and now that can manifest as me trying to control you or you trying to control me. But we need to see the essence of it, trying desperate attempts to try and fix the relationships, which can be by trying to change it, by trying to control what happens in the conversation, by trying to control my partner. And of course, the last one, which is very important, trying to minimize emotional intensity. Within a relationship, there's a window of tolerance. And within us individually, we have a window of tolerance. This means there's a range of emotional intensity we can tolerate. And the moment we are beyond that, we stop being healthy adults. We stop functioning as adults who can reason and reflect and still be curious about the other person. We stop doing that. And what destructive interactions do is they push the window they push individuals outside of the window of tolerance, and the relationship interaction itself goes out of the window of tolerance of the couple, what the couple as a whole can actually tolerate. These are the extreme escalations or extreme withdrawals that we see in relationships. So to understand destructive behaviors, the right way of doing this is not to go and focus on what one individual is doing and to shame them or to assign sort of intention to it. For example, words that are very often used in social media: gaslighting, narcissism, stonewalling. These are real things, but the way in which this is used often is actually in itself part of the destructive pattern, which is blaming one person for doing things in a unilateral way to another person. Destructive interactions, even though the focus is on individuals taking ownership for what they do and how they do it, are always linked to the pattern of interaction across time and the behavior of the other person, the things that the person does and doesn't do. And to really understand it and help the couple without scapegoating one individual is to look at that cause. Now, this is what we do in couple therapy, but it always starts with stopping the injury. In couple therapy, I want couples to start having success. That means having small interactions, conversations in the moment, where the conversation, one, doesn't escalate, doesn't leave either person feeling it's unsafe and they need to defend themselves and they need to engage in these destructive interactions. And three, where they feel this was good, this felt okay. Not amazing, just okay, this felt safe. So it's an accumulation of small successes. But to do that, each individual has to take ownership of not engaging in destructive interactions. So hopefully this sort of provided a little bit of an overview of just what these things are and why they are so crucial in relationships.